And thank you for coming back. We're live. We're going to turn it over to David now to start the Q&A.
Hi, I just wanted to thank everyone who's been submitting questions. I wanted to mention that we have people registered for this webinar from every single continent except Antarctica, and so we do appreciate all the questions that we are receiving. The amount that we've received thus far certainly exceeds the amount of time we have for this Q&A period, but we will continue to answer questions in the upcoming Q&A sessions, and we will also roll some of the answers into the subsequent presentations. So in the interest of time, too, we're also trying to sort of cluster questions together. So there were a number of questions about app availability in the app stores, and I just wanted to mention again that the open source code is actually for two versions of the app, an Android app and an iOS app. So if you rebrand it, adapt it, and then you want to publish it, you would actually rebrand and adapt both apps, and then you would work with the app stores and publish them in the respective app stores, Google Play and the Apple App Store. We also received a question about the FDA webpage. As some of you may know, the FDA recently sort of updated its web resources, and the web page has a new look, and it said, could you tell us where to find it? And I think the best way to find it is to Google FDA MyStudies mobile app, hit return, and it should be the top link that you see there. We also have the URLs listed here on this resources slide. We received an important question about essentially if we use this system, is this an FDA system and is the data flowing to the FDA? And that's really important. I want to emphasize that. This is an open source system. We're providing the code and technical documentation. The intent is that you can use this system yourselves, deploy it, publish it yourselves, through your own organizations, and maintain the data securely as appropriate for your uses. And so fundamentally, while we developed it and we originally published it in the app stores and we operated the system to test it as proof of concept, this is yours to use, and data do not automatically flow back to FDA. And there was a related question which was essentially along the lines of, if we take all this code and we use the app, are we obligated to, and we make improvements, for instance, and we say develop a proprietary version, are we obligated by the FDA to return additional code that we use back to the open source community, and the FDA is not obligating groups to do that? So again, we are providing this as public service, but you are not obligated to return additional code to the GitHub. We certainly appreciate comments that we receive to the GitHub and people who want to contribute and possibly even contribute code, but there is no obligation. Let's see, we were also asked, is the system open source and free? And it is open source and free. We will have an additional piece of that because the instance of the LabKey server architecture that we implemented had sort of extra features that are not part of the open source LabKey platform, and Adam will discuss that in more detail. We received a question about whether or not use of this app is limited to clinical trials or studies involving drugs and or biologics. And in general, as you saw in Zach's demo through the web configuration portal, this is a fairly configurable system and is likely to be usable in almost any type of medical product outcome situation. So while it hasn't necessarily been tested, for instance, in a medical device outcome study. It doesn't necessarily preclude someone from using it to look at other types of interventions, such as medical devices. We also received a question about whether or not the FDA certifies systems as 21 CFR Part 11 compliant, and the FDA does not certify any systems as 21 Part 11 compliant. And so I would encourage you to look at the guidance that is available in the resources, and you can see more discussion of why that is and FDA's guidance on that. But just as we don't certify any system, we don't certify this system either, pertaining to that guidance. Another important issue we were asked about was ex-US use. In other words, is this app only for use in the United States? And I think there's sort of two parts to that question. One part would sort of be from a regulatory sense. So, and from the point of view of the FDA, many of you may be aware that clinical trial data used in new drug approvals or new drug applications and biologics license applications do not necessarily all come from the United States. And so there's essentially an expectation that there may be ex-US use of this app to support ex-US studies. So again, there's no limitation on this to the US population. Now I'd like to turn this over to Ranjani and then Adam, because the next sort of piece of this question is, it's obviously the platform has been implemented using the English language, and so we obviously want to talk about what would be necessary to implement in other languages.
Thank you, David. Hi, this is Ranjani from Boston Technology Corporation. So one of the questions in terms of multiple language support and how that works today on this platform, there are three main components to the application. Well, actually four, but three that relate to language: the mobile app, the study configuration portal that Zach just demoed, and the response server. So I'm going to talk about the mobile app and the WCP. So out of the box, both the mobile app and the WCP do not support multiple languages, but when we designed and built it, we developed, or we have support or the foundation to be able to accommodate other languages. So there would need to be some level of effort at the WCP level to allow study administrators, study content managers to enter content for the study, the questions, the active tasks in the language of their choice. The mobile app is built today to pull the content from what are known as like language bundles, to use a little bit of a technical term. And it right now supports only English, but we can actually support multiple languages with a smaller amount of effort on the mobile app. So again, to kind of recap, the foundation is there, but the complete out-of-the-box support is not in there right now. And having said that, I'm going to turn this over to Adam to talk a little bit more about how the response server would support multiple languages. Thanks.
Thank you, Ranjani. This is Adam from LabKey. So as far as multiple languages, the response server, which I'll talk about a little while in a few moments, describe that in more detail. But the response server is primarily used by, or really solely used by, study administrators and data analysts. Most of the user interface there is going to be in English. However, the response server can collect data responses in any language. It supports ASCII and non-ASCII characters, and so should support anything that can be conveyed in UTF-8. And that has been tested in a variety of different modes. We would probably want to test this entire system in terms of getting responses in other languages, but all of the underpinnings are there, and there are no known issues with regard to that. There were a few other questions that I thought I would address if we have time. David already emphasized and Zach already emphasized that all components of the system are free and open source. There are a number of questions related to that, so we'll just emphasize that again. All components are free and open source. So there were questions about whether there are any costs with regard to LabKey Server. Again, you can deploy the system with the free and open source version of LabKey Server. We call it the Community Edition. We have chosen to deploy the pilot version and the current production version of the environment that we're using for a couple of studies here, using a component called the compliance module. That module is not open source. It just makes it a little easier to deploy in a HIPAA or FSMA or Part 11 compliant environment. So we've chosen to use that component. It's not required for the system. It's not required to be compliant either. It just provides some of those controls of those regulations are included in the product itself, just to make it a little easier to deploy in that manner. There were also some questions relating to where is the data server hosted and how can I host this. So you will hear from Stuart McDonald a little later today about the current deployment and how we've chosen to deploy this system for our testing and production use. We've chosen to use Amazon AWS as our platform, but you could use any cloud environment. You could deploy it on-premise. You are free to use it in any environment that you wish. There were a couple of questions about the underlying technology stack. My colleagues at Boston Technology Corporation and I will talk about this in a lot more detail, but fundamentally these are web applications that sit on top of Java, Tomcat, and open source relational databases like MySQL and Postgres. So that's sort of a glimpse ahead, basically full open source stacks as well. We happen to deploy on Linux, but you could deploy on Windows as well, just as easily. So, and then one more question about compliance. I assume that all parts are compliant with FDA Part 11, but are the PHI and data collected all encrypted? Again, in our case, we've chosen to configure our environment with full encryption of all data, both in transit and at rest. That, of course, is your option and how you choose to deploy the system. We'd certainly recommend that, but that is the manner in which we have done it. With the remaining 3 minutes before our break, I'll answer a couple of other questions. An extension to this compliance question, I just wanted to also mention, obviously, that there's obviously design attributes of this system that are intended to support compliance, so it can be operated in a compliant manner, but there's other aspects of compliance, including policies, procedures, SOPs. The other thing to mention, obviously, is even if the whole MyStudies platform is compliant, it's important for your trial or your real-world data sort of study data management to also be compliant. So you don't want to bolt on a compliant app system on top of a non-compliant system otherwise. So just something to keep in mind there. We actually had a couple of questions about informed consent. So there was a question where there was some concern. It sort of said, what can we do if we have a concern about providing sufficient consent information through the app. And so, the consent system is robust, but may not necessarily meet the needs of a study team. And there's nothing about the MyStudies platform that precludes you from engaging in face-to-face informed consent. Certainly, for instance, the trial that we're working with currently, they already have the patient face-to-face in the clinic visit. They are screening in the clinic visit, and there's going to be enrollment and randomized treatment allocation. And so during that whole process, it makes perfect sense to have informed consent in a face-to-face manner. And there's no specific reason to use the informed consent module within MyStudies. There was sort of a question about are you sort of then what do you do with the module? So, and Zach can talk about this more in a future Q&A, but essentially we have chosen to kind of retain some use of the module to essentially have the patient additionally sort of essentially consent to the fact that they're using the app, and that and note that they have already consented to the trial as a whole, which includes use of the app and additional types of data use. So that's just kind of something to keep in mind. So I think actually that I am at the end here, and I'll turn it back over to Jeff.
Absolutely, and that wraps up the questions that we're going to cover during this break. As we are back on the regular schedule, we're going to take about a 30-minute break or so for lunch for everybody to grab, and then we'll come back to pick it up per the agenda. Any of the questions that weren't covered just yet, we'll probably circle back around to those this afternoon. If you need to download the agenda or get any other information, please go to SBIAevents.com. Otherwise, we'll start back up here at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time.